Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by OraSure Technologies. OraSure Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy-to-administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. Oral fluid-based testing products provide a simplified collection process, faster results, cost savings with minimal risk of tampering, and dramatically reduced risk of adulteration. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is an FDA-cleared laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate drug testing for drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, and opiates. With a fast and easy-to-administer collection process, Intercept is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, and clinical setting screening programs, among others. Today's presentation is entitled Drug Testing the Right Way for the Drugs People Are Using Today, and will be presented by Bill Current and Judy Swartley. Bill Current is the president and founder of WFC & Associates, a national consulting firm that specializes in drug testing policy development and providing accurate and up-to-date state drug testing law information. He is the editor of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com and the publisher of the e-newsletter State Drug Testing Laws Monthly and the weekly e-news service Drug Testing in the News. Judy Swartley is the president of Red Planet Substance Abuse Testing, a leading provider of drug and alcohol testing services to many industries, including the construction industry. She has been involved with substance abuse testing since 2000. She has also experience as the safety director at a mid-sized contracting business, working in heavy manufacturing as the QC manager of a 4,200-person facility of Honeywell, and teaching at Lehigh University and Penn State University. It will now be our pleasure to hear from Bill Current and Judy Swartley.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica, and welcome to everybody who's on today's webinar. First, I want to just give thanks to OraSure and thank them for the wonderful series of webinars that they hosted in 2013, and welcome to the first of what will be many OraSure hosted webinars this year in 2014. So thanks again to OraSure for putting on these webinars and making them available to people in the industry as well as to your clients. Also, I'm real excited to be co-presenting today with Judy Swartley from Red Planet Substance Abuse Testing. Judy and I did a webinar last year together on drug testing in the construction industry, and it was very informative, so I'm looking forward to her part of today's presentation. I'm going to start out just by laying a little bit of groundwork. Those of you who have heard me present in the past, you know I like to do this just to make sure we're all on the same page, we understand what we're talking about. And so first, we're just going to talk about the magnitude of the drug problem in the United States. Every year, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, puts out a survey that's called the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And so the 2012 numbers came out in 2013, sort of around the August-September timeframe. So these are the latest statistics that are available from the federal government, and they track drug usage among Americans of all different ages, you know, by gender, by ethnicity, by employment status, etc. And so there is tons of data in that report. It's well worth going to the website and checking it out. You can break it down by portions of the country, by states, etc. Well worth your time to spend a little bit of your time in that survey looking for information that may be specifically pertinent to the states where you do business. But it's important to note that in 2012, there were nearly 24 million Americans who self-admitted in this survey to having used an illicit drug at least once in the last month. That's the definition of a current drug user, according to the federal government. Now, that's just over 9% of the population, 12 and older, and really sort of at the heart of this whole problem is marijuana and the increase in marijuana abuse throughout the country at various age levels, but particularly among young people. I'm going to show you that in a second. Of the nearly 24 million people who admitted to being current illicit drug users, 18.9 million were marijuana users, and of that, 79% were only marijuana users. About two-thirds, 62.8%. of the illicit drug users only use marijuana. So it's not only the drug of choice, but for many people it's the only drug that they use. And that's a significant thing when we talk about synthetic cannabinoids or synthetic marijuana, which we're going to talk a lot about today, because a lot of people are trying to get around a drug test where they would normally test positive for marijuana by using synthetic marijuana. And so they're getting kind of the similar high from synthetic cannabinoids that they get from marijuana, but a lot more to the story than that. But because of the increase in marijuana, we're seeing also this corresponding interest in and increase in the use of synthetic marijuana. Now, the number and percentage of persons 12 and older who were current users of marijuana, very similar to 2011, okay, not a lot of change. It did go from 18.1 million to 18.9 million, so that is significant. But really not a lot of change. Between 2007 and 2012, for example, the rate of use increased from 5.8 to 7.3. So there's that dynamic increase. And then the number of users went from 14.5 million to 18.9 million. So really a significant increase in the total number of marijuana users, which is really moving that top line number, the total number of current illicit drug users. That top line number, that 23.9, that's a hard number to move. Obviously, the bigger the pool, the harder it is to get that dial to move. But because of the significant, even dramatic increase in marijuana use, it's actually affected that top line number, that 23.9 million. So now, among non-users or of marijuana or people who use drugs other than marijuana, the majority were actually people who were abusing psychotherapeutic drugs. So we're talking about pain relievers, tranquilizers, stimulants, and sedatives. That's significant because for many years, the number 2 drug of abuse after marijuana has always been number 1, but after marijuana, for many years, the number 2 drug of abuse was cocaine. And so now we've seen that the sort of this family of psychotherapeutic drugs, the tranquilizers, the pain relievers, etc., combined have now moved into the number 2 spot. And by a significant margin, if you look at this chart, the top line is, of course, the 23.9 million, then marijuana at 18.9, psychotherapeutic drug abuse, the non-medical use of prescription drugs, etc., 6.8 million compared to 1.6 million for cocaine, and then, on down the line from there. So after years of being number 2, cocaine is now in the number 3 spot and way, way behind the abuse of psychotherapeutics. That is a significant development in the drug abuse industry. Now, when you look at drug abuse among young people, and I'm going to tell you why I think this is important in a second. It's important anyways, but why it's important to you, the audience today. When you're looking at 12 and 13-year-olds, psychotherapeutic drugs are the number 1 drug of choice. That's the drug of choice among 12 and 13-year-olds as you look to the left of that bar graph. Marijuana number 2, of course. By the time they get to 14, 15, marijuana shoots up there, okay? Psychotherapeutic drug abuse also increases, but the abuse of marijuana or the use of marijuana increases even more significantly. So there's a reversal there in which is number 1, number 2. By 16, 17, juniors, seniors in high school, et cetera, we're looking at a significant increase in the number of marijuana users, but also, relatively speaking, a significant increase in the number of young people who are abusing psychotherapeutic drugs. This is important, I believe, because, and I wrote a book on this many years ago called Today's Teen Drug User, Tomorrow's Job Applicant. So it's important for employers and adults to look at these drug abuse levels for young people, particularly as they get into their teen years, to see the level of drug abuse and the experience with drug abuse that these young people are bringing into the workforce when they graduate from high school, or maybe even before they graduate from high school, right? And they're looking for their first job. They know about drugs. They certainly know about drugs, and an alarming number of them have experience using drugs. So these numbers are important. Now, beyond the use of real marijuana, there has been, and it's widely reported in the media, so very few people who haven't heard about this, but you may not know a lot about it, is the use of synthetic marijuana, fake pot, or synthetic cannabinoids. Well-known names, K2 and Spice, I put there to start with. if somebody put some spice in front of you, some synthetic cannabinoids, it would look like the pictures that you see on the screen right now. It would look like maybe real marijuana to some extent, but it's not. It's sold as an incense, and consumers are typically warned not to consume it, but it's not an organic product. It's made in a laboratory or maybe on somebody's kitchen table. The finished product looks like crushed grass, like marijuana or something like marijuana, but it's not. It's not organic at all. And there are literally hundreds of names. I pulled a few off of the internet. I even added to this yesterday to get the latest names that are out there. Spice, of course, has sort of become the generic name for synthetic cannabinoids in the same way maybe Kleenex is for, facial tissue. But spice comes in, or synthetic marijuana comes in lots and lots of different brand names. And so Algerian Blend to Black Mamba to Sexy Monkey, you see different configurations of the word spice, spice diamond, spice silver, spice gold, etc. And the reason I point that out is because, for one thing, it's because it doesn't matter what the brand name is. There's no regulations, that are sort of ensuring the quality of the product that somebody's buying, thinking they're getting something that's going to do one thing, but they have no idea what's in that package. There are no rules. In fact, I don't have the slide today, but I did read an article by somebody who did a study of 100 different packets of spice from the same seller. And as he investigated each one of them, he found that there was, even within the same, what appeared to be the same batches, there was little continuity from package to package. And he concluded that there are no rules. There is no consistency from one package to the next, from one brand to the next, or from one maker to the next. Even within the same batch, there may not be any continuity from one package to the next. Very, very scary stuff, and you got to be careful. It looks like marijuana. It's used like marijuana is used, but it's not really marijuana. People use it because it has that same effect or similar effects. Some statistics that you might find interesting. According to the DEA, there are over 1,000 synthetic drug makers in the United States alone. And, of course, a lot of the product that people in the U.S. are purchasing is coming from outside of the United States. They're purchasing it over the Internet from China, for example. But here in the United States, well over 1,000 synthetic drug makers. It's a multi-billion-dollar market, the recreational drug market, according to the Cato Institute. There is a sort of a legitimate incense business industry, of course, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry as well here in the United States, and there are hundreds of manufacturers and wholesalers and retailers of incense products. Spice is being marketed and sold to the public as if it was a legitimate incense product. In reality, it's not, even though the packaging may say that it's not for human consumption. People are purchasing it with the intent to consume it, and sellers are selling it knowing that their customers are going to consume it. And so it may be marketed as an incense product, but in fact it's not. And probation officers and youth counselors, et cetera, are reporting increasing numbers of cases that they're working on with individuals who have history of using synthetic cannabinoids. Now, just so you understand how this works, a kilo of raw material is about $1,500 to $2,500. The raw material would be the different products that that a manufacturer would use to the chemical compounds, etc. There's also the plant material. That's a separate cost altogether. So a metric ton, this according to the DEA, metric ton of plant material that would typically be used would be maybe another $1,500. You add packaging to the mix and then divide your product into packages of 3 to 5 grams per package, and you sell it for about $30 a package. For $5,000 of an investment on your part, you're going to potentially be looking at about $250,000 at the retail level. And so why would people do this? Obviously, always for the money, but the return on investment is incredible, right? And so when you talk about, and we're going to talk about the different laws and the chemical compounds, but when you look at the potential investment and return on investment, you can see why there are so many manufacturers just in the United States alone, and others who are selling it from foreign countries to consumers in the United States. The return on investment is significant. Now, fake pot. Easily modified chemical structures allow chemists, if you put that in quotation marks, I use that term loosely, let's say, to stay in front of the various laws that are being passed at the state and the federal levels, okay? Easy to find online at gas stations, convenience stores, head shops, where people buy paraphernalia for drug using, but not really legitimate chemists, or maybe they could be legitimate college-trained chemists that are making this, but it's a very clandestine type of industry. Now, when the various chemical compounds are changed, it changes the legality of the product. So, for example, when a state passes a law banning a certain chemical compound that is used to make spice, the chemist, the manufacturer, the guy sitting at his kitchen table making this stuff, simply fools around with the chemical compound, the chemical structure, until he's got something that basically gives the user the same effect, but is now a different chemical compound altogether, not found on the list of compounds that are banned by a state law or by the Drug Enforcement Administration. They have now skirted themselves around the legality problem, and they're selling what is essentially a legal product again. And that's not all that difficult to do. Now, if you're concerned about this because you know that you're hiring people in sort of that demographic category where they are more likely to be using synthetic marijuana, you should understand that a routine lab test, the typical 5-panel, 9-panel test that you're used to using in your business, for example, or that maybe as a provider you're selling to your client, you know that's not going to detect synthetic marijuana. Okay, a real marijuana test will not also detect synthetic cannabinoids. That is a different test altogether. So the chemical compounds are constantly changing. The accessibility is as good and solid as it's ever been. And if you think you're testing for synthetic marijuana with your marijuana drug test that you routinely conduct, then you can see how the problem magnifies, okay? Now, something very important to keep in mind. There's a huge and by and large very successful movement afoot throughout the country to legalize marijuana for medicinal purposes. Everybody knows about that, but also just to legalize it, period. I mean, and we've got some slides at the end that we can get into on that. And Judy wanted to maybe talk or have us talk a little bit about an update on that, and if we have time, we'll do that, but they'll be part of this slide deck. But the fact of the matter is that the pro-marijuana people hate it when synthetic cannabinoids are compared to real marijuana. They understand that fake marijuana, fake pot, is a major PR problem for them. And so you'll see the proponents of legalization of marijuana out there trying to, through the media, make a clear distinction between real marijuana and fake marijuana. But the reality is that fake marijuana has the same effects on people, if not more so, as real marijuana. So that's a real problem for the marijuana proponents. The effects of usage are very, very much like real marijuana. Maybe there are some strains, some brands of fake marijuana that are hundreds of times stronger than real marijuana, according to various sources. The duration of the high may be shorter or longer depending on the kind of real marijuana somebody may be using, but the effects on the individual in the workplace are very similar between fake pot and real pot. And again, the pro-marijuana people hate it when we make that comparison, but the truth of the matter is it's fake pot for a reason. It may not be organic marijuana, but it is developed and designed to give the user kind of a similar marijuana high, which includes all of the negative side effects that impair somebody's ability to safely operate a vehicle, heavy machinery, do other safety-sensitive jobs in the workplace. These are some of the effects on the user of fake marijuana, everything from paranoia to mental illness. We really still don't know the extent of damage to the brain and to the body that ingesting fake marijuana, synthetic cannabinoids, will have on individuals long term. But we do know that there are reports of people who are experiencing these types of problems, okay? Barbara Roche, and I got this article from the Huffington Post, and I found great information on the Huffington Post. You may not agree with their politics, but they've got great information on synthetic cannabinoids, on bath salts, on, we're going to talk about crocodile a little bit later, and they've got pages on all of these drugs. So a lot of good information there. Here's a quote from a special agent in charge of the Denver division of the DEA. There can be a euphoria. There's a mental addiction. So remember, the pro-marijuana people say marijuana itself is not addictive. There are studies to the contrary, but that's one of their claims. Well, with the fake marijuana, there is a tendency toward the quote-unquote mental or psychological addiction, wanting that next high. There's vomiting, nausea, accelerated heart rate, blood pressure can shoot up, kidney damage. There's some very disturbing and more aggressive type reactions that we're seeing. Violence, almost like a freezing of the body that becomes statue-like, and everything shuts down. So it's everything, she says. It's physical and it's psychological. So from the employer standpoint, of course, these side effects could have a very negative impact on that person, that employee's ability to function in the workplace. But if you're a parent or a parental guardian of a young person, of course, these would be concerns, just as they would be if you had a kid that was using real marijuana, or if you had an employee that was using real marijuana. Now, something very interesting in the trends. The calls to the U.S. Poison Control Centers have actually decreased significantly in the last 2 years. They peaked in sort of midway around 2011, somewhat steady throughout the rest of the year, but sort of peaked at a certain level. And then they started coming down in 2012 and 2013. And some people believe that the decrease in calls to poison control centers may be because the information is getting out there and people are being forewarned about the dangers of using these substances. But there are reports. There was a 2013 report from the Center on Substance Abuse that showed that synthetic cannabinoids, fake marijuana, K2 spice, was the #3 drug of abuse among high school students in certain parts of the country. So obviously that's a concern. And as part of that study, and I'll have to get that if anybody would like to see it, I'll track it down for you. But it also said that these high school students, keep in mind, the percentage of schools that do drug testing is fairly small. It's a growing number. It's sort of a burgeoning area of the drug testing industry, but small by comparison to the percentage of employers that do drug testing. And what's interesting is that high school students who identified themselves as synthetic marijuana users said that they used it because they were concerned about testing positive for real marijuana in a school drug test. And that once that concern passed, maybe they sort of game the system in their school. They know when the random selections are going to occur, et cetera, whatever their thinking or reasoning may be. Once that passes, then they admit they go back to using real marijuana. So they basically see it, in some cases, as sort of a way to continue to get high, not get caught in a drug test, and then once the storm passes, then they go back to using real marijuana. Again, I would think that would be a concern to the pro-marijuana people who are out there positioning real marijuana as a harmless substance. Late 2010 analysis found alarming positive rates. Now, there is drug testing going on. There is drug testing going on for synthetic cannabinoids, for fake pot, and in certain areas of the drug testing industry, say, for example, in criminal justice and drug courts, et cetera, in some places they're seeing some pretty alarming positivity rates. And I've got them up on the screen. We don't need to go into a lot of detail, but if you look at that last bullet, the National Laboratory Certification Program survey of just 6 labs, the percentages were from 2% to nearly 50% positive for synthetic cannabinoids. So that's a wide swing, and especially among a small sampling of just 6 labs. But on average, that would be about a 20% positivity rate if you averaged it out. So from 2% to 40-something%, average 20%, that still kind of alarms me, of course, because if we're getting positive rates at that level, knowing that not a lot of employers are testing for the drug or for the substance yet, and we also know that the effects of the drug are very, very similar to real marijuana, then, of course, that's got to cause us concern. That means that there are probably a growing number of people in the workplace who are getting high on synthetic cannabinoids, knowing that their employer is not testing for it. Now, federal government and state legislatures have moved over the years to try to get in front of this issue from a legal standpoint. There are federal bans on certain synthetic cannabinoid compounds. There are state laws that legislatively have banned synthetic cannabinoids. There's a lot of information at the National Conference of State Legislatures website. We also track it on our website at statedrugtestinglaws.com. It's a moving target. It really is. As I mentioned earlier, the chemical compounds are constantly changing to get around these laws. And so when a state passes a law that bans a specific kind of chemical compound, and usually they're designated with some kind of an acronym that has like a JWH, which are the initials of the original person who is credited with creating synthetic cannabinoids, a Clemson professor by the name of Huffman. JWH, and then there'll be some numbers after it, and those numbers will sort of differentiate a chemical compound from another chemical compound. A state will pass a law that bans JWH40, and by changing the chemical compound and structure just a little bit, then suddenly the manufacturers of the substance have sort of gotten around the law, and they're again selling a quote-unquote legal product. And so some states have now started to pass laws, or they're introducing laws, legislation I should say, that ban synthetic cannabinoids generally, regardless of the chemical compound. A little bit harder of a law to perhaps get passed because you might have some real techies in your state legislature who know about chemistry and how these things are done. But generally speaking, banning synthetic cannabinoids generally is sort of an approach that is being tried now in a number of states, and we'll see how that works out. Same problem exists at the federal level. In 2012, July 2012, the president signed the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act, instituting a federal ban on 31 designer drugs. 20 synthetic marijuana chemicals were classified as Schedule I drugs. That was later reduced, I think, to 15 synthetic marijuana chemicals. But some pretty serious criminal penalties or consequences were attached to violating that drug, punishable by up to 20 years in prison. So putting a little bit of teeth into the law there helps to some extent. But if you go back to that return on investment page that I showed you, where a $5,000 investment can yield a potential $250,000 in profit or return on investment, you can see why people take that chance. It's the exact same allure that existed, with crack cocaine and still does to some extent, and with the methamphetamine, etc. So, taking a lot of time on that. We're not going to speak as long about bath salts, but I do have a few slides on that. So first off, we talked about synthetic cannabinoids, synthetic marijuana, fake pot. Now we're going to talk about bath salts. And they look like bath salts, okay? They're not the same kind of bath salts necessarily that we might put in our bath water, but they look this way, and they have, just like with K2 and Spice, there are many, many, many different brand names on the market. It's similar to K2 and Spice in terms of being, but in this case, it's a designer stimulant. It's like I used the term clandestine, produced in clandestine labs, sold online, or you'll find it in gas stations, in head shops, smoke shops, etc. It's promoted as bath salts, sometimes called research chemicals or even plant food originally, years ago. I don't know that you still see that as much anymore. But the product labeling is always careful, just like with K2 and Spice, to suggest that it is not for human consumption. Again, I think we'd be hard pressed to give much leeway to the sellers of these products and suggest that they don't think that their customers are consuming it. They know they're consuming it, but they try to get around it by having that labeling on there. Typically, you're going to see MDPV as the active ingredient in bath salts. Additional forms of the designer stimulants may be sold as legal MDMA, sometimes called Legal X, or sold and veiled as MDMA tablets. So very scary because, again, you don't know what you're getting. According to the American Association of Poison Control Centers, and I'll quote them, synthetic cathinones, these are the bath salts, often marked as bath salts, have names like Cloud9 and Bliss. They are not bath salts you use in your tub. These are powerful illegal drugs that have not been tested for safety, and users don't really know exactly what chemicals they are putting into their bodies. The side effects they cause may be permanent. So very, very strong wording in this alert that was put out by the AAPCC. Most users will snort it, or in some cases inject it. Well, it's called bath salts. Appears to affect users in ways similar to methamphetamine and cocaine. Sometimes you'll see amphetamine, but I think it's most commonly methamphetamine and cocaine. Reports concerning very aggressive behavior, paranoia, etc., may be much more toxic than the cocaine and the methamphetamine that people are used to using. Long-term effects, really just like with K2 and Spice, really not known yet, but we are starting to get some data on the effects of bath salts on the cardiovascular system for a period of days after ingestion. Users are looking for a certain high from bath salts, feelings of physical and mental well-being, exhilaration, euphoria. There's sort of an increased alertness, energy, motor activity like cocaine users would have, the postponement of hunger and fatigue. Now, this is important because you may be in a workplace in which you have people who are working late shifts, etc., all night long, working back-to-back shifts, things of that nature, where they might be trying to enhance their alertness and their ability to stay on the job by using certain types of drugs. Now, there have been some really, really ugly stories in the media about the types of violent behavior bath salt has caused with certain people, where they have viciously attacked another person in a very grotesque way. That may be the sort of exception, but it's certainly a possibility. Some of the negative effects on a user range from paranoia to combativeness to suicidal thoughts even. And just sort of almost like a PCP effect, the Superman effect, the excited delirium effect of PCP might, in some cases, also be with the user of bath salts. Very, very scary stuff. Lots of headlines. These are some headlines I typically use. There are many, many others out there. Stories of people doing very bizarre things while under the influence of bath salts. And I just put a few of them here. You know, you can find them very easily by going online and looking for them. Sometimes they're comical, sometimes they're very tragic and unfortunate, the things that do occur. In 2012, Poison Control Centers took over almost 2,700 calls about individual exposure to bath salts. Seems to be most popular with people in their 20s. However, through the Poison Control Centers, they've had calls regarding individuals as young as 6 and as old as 59. Lots of data on that on the website. As far as laws go, 43 states and Puerto Rico have legislative banned substitute cathinones or bath salts. There's a lot of information that's available, again, at the National Conference of State Legislatures website. We also track it. But you're not going to, again, you're not going to stop everybody from manufacturing and using this simply because it's banned. Even with the federal ban that was part of that July 2012 law that President Obama signed, which was a significant step forward. No question about that. That was a good thing, the right thing to do. But of course, the manufacturers are constantly one step ahead of us when it comes to these things. I want to get to Judy's part, so let me just mention in terms of other drugs. I know some of the other names you're hearing out there, Molly, for example, which is marketed as a pure form of MDMA. In many cases, it's anything but pure MDMA. It's typically cut with lots of other drugs, sometimes even cut with PCP, which makes it an extremely dangerous and potentially deadly combination of substances. There have been reports of people using Molly, quote-unquote Molly, at all-night dance clubs, getting that, that excited delirium effect, and then dying. So there have been deaths associated with the use of Molly. Lots of information on the internet on that. I won't take a lot of time. And you'll have these slides, of course. But I did want to point out, though, that, again, not that expensive, $15 to $50 for a single dose, $100 for a gram of Molly. It's out there. It's available. There are a lot of negative side effects. There have been people that have been that have died as a result of using, quote unquote, this pure form of MDMA, but a very dangerous drug as well. Now, I started to put together a whole section on crocodile. I resisted the temptation. I refer you to this Huffington Post website, which has a lot of good information on it. The pictures of individuals using this product, which is sometimes called a flesh-eating drug because of the impact it has on the flesh of the individual, the pictures are just, in some cases, horrifying, and yet people continue to use this substance. A lot of information on there. It may or may not be a substance that you're going to have a lot of concern with in the workplace, although it depends on the part of the country. It seems to be popular in certain areas of the country, the Midwest, for example, having a particular problem with this. But it could also be something that you're just not going to have an issue with in your workplace because the outward effects and impact on the user are fairly obvious and significant. You would know if somebody was doing this or possibly doing this. Now, we've talked a lot about these synthetic drugs, these designer products. There are, of course, the expanded opiates. If you get into psychotherapeutic drugs, the expanded opioid panels with the hydros and the oxys, etc. Lots of other drugs. When we talk about testing for the right drugs, that's one of the most important questions we have to ask ourselves in the drug testing industry and business right now. Because if you're testing for the what's called the SAMHSA 5, marijuana, cocaine, opiates, amphetamines, and PCP, you could very well be missing the possibility, the opportunity to identify people who really need help or to deter drug use in your workplace by not testing for barbiturates, benzodiazepines, the expanded opiate panels, etc., because those are in many cases the drugs that people are using. Yes, marijuana is at the top. Continue to test for marijuana, but these other drugs are right there, number two, right? The whole family of psychotherapeutics are right there behind, far behind marijuana, but way ahead of cocaine. And so those are the drugs that a lot of people are using and too many employers are not testing for. And so what I'd like to do now is pass the ball, so to speak. If you were looking at my screen, you'd see I have a ball next to my name, and I pass it over to Judy. And Judy will now take us through a discussion of oral fluid drug testing, especially regarding marijuana and some of these substances that we talked about today. So, Judy, take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. I'd like to also thank OraSure for hosting this conference and also the ability or opportunity to work with Bill. Many of you know he was the first director of the Institute for Drug-Free America, and his reputation precedes him. All righty, so let's take a look at oral fluid drug testing. Typically, traditional lab-based drug testing methods work at detecting synthetic marijuana, and that includes the urine and the oral fluid. However, the lab won't conduct a traditional test for THC if it's a different test to detect the chemical structure of synthetic marijuana. But it can be detected with lab-based oral fluids and urine. So far, I haven't found any evidence that instant urine testing devices, including products marked as home drug testing kits, work at detecting the synthetic marijuana. Now, when you talk about oral fluid testing, it's really important to know that many, many years ago, there was a product on the market that was not a good test. But oral fluid testing has come a long way. One of the advantages is, well, it's not urine. It's not messy. You don't have any of the preparing the bathroom that you have to go through. It's easy to administer, virtually impossible to adulterate, and that is a key feature to OraSure or to Intercept. It's legal in most jurisdictions, legally defensible, and really rapidly increasing in popularity. Basically, with the Intercept lab-based saliva drug test, it only takes 5 minutes to conduct the test. You get the results in 24 hours on the internet. It is virtually adulteration-proof, and it eliminates shy bladder issues or dilution issues. And these are really critical, especially in the southern and the southwest areas where people tend to drink water a lot during the day. That can cause dilution issues if they are going for the urine test. It's flexible, can be collected anytime, anywhere. It's legal in 48 states. The exceptions are Hawaii and Maine. Legally defensible as technology, scientifically accurate. And it's important to note here that the manufacturer of Intercept, OraSure, has a lot of documentations to back up these statements. It's also a more accurate method to measure recent use. And the importance there is that you can detect marijuana with Intercept or any of the drugs relatively soon after the drug gets into the body. On the other hand, with urine drug testing, sometimes it can take 4 to 6 hours to get into the urine. So that's pretty critical if you're interested in if you saw somebody using drugs on the job and you want to test them right away. Okay, let's go on to the next slide here. Easy to administer. You don't have any of the yuck factors that are normally associated with urine testing. The next bullet here, gender collector issues are eliminated. Sometimes people might think, well, what's so important about that? Well, we have a couple landscape contractors who used to use the instant urine test and tell the guys, because the crews were made up of all men, to go behind the tree and give them a sample. But they can't do that anymore with women on the teams. So using Intercept is an extremely easy way to solve the problem, not only to solve the problem, but to get an extremely accurate test. Observed collections can occur with every test. Collection process is not embarrassing. And again, you don't have to worry about shutting down the bathroom, turning off all the water that goes into it. All right, so let's take a look at cheating issues. As you know, urine tests are extremely easy to beat. I was giving a presentation a couple of months ago, and I held up a bottle of synthetic urine. And one of the people in the audience sort of gasped and said, "Oh my gosh, I've been seeing these small white bottles outside of our collection rooms and never knew what they were." So synthetic urine comes in a temperature-controlled pouch. People typically strap it to their legs or strap it to their arms, and then when they get into the bathroom to give the sample, they dump that in the cup. Because legally, collection centers are only allowed to ask people to empty their pockets. With oral fluid, there's no way of that happening because the collection takes place in the presence of both the donor and the administrator of the test. And it's important here to note that the administrator doesn't touch the test other than to give it to the person taking the test. The donor does all the work. There is no saliva touching involved. The donor will put it in his or her mouth. They'll put it in the test tube. They'll put the safety seal on it, and that's the end of that. So typical cheating methods of switching or using synthetics are not possible with the Intercept test. If you would go on to search the internet, you'll find thousands of hits for cheating on a urine drug test. All you have to do is Google "pass my drug test," Google synthetic urine, and you'll find many, many sites that will supply materials for that. Now, most of our companies are in a variety of industries, but we're really seeing that the oral fluid, the lab-based oral fluid testing, is becoming extremely popular with construction companies, contracting companies, nursing homes, manufacturing, hospitality, retailing, staffing, and occupational health centers. In particular, because they can do it right then and there. They don't have to waste the time of the employee going to a collection center. And as most of you know that do the urine collection, this can take up at least an hour. When I used to work in industry, it would take longer than that because, of course, they'd have to buy their cup of coffee on the way back, or they would get lost, or whatever the excuse. So with this test, at the most, it takes 15 minutes. It takes 5 minutes to collect the sample, and then maybe another 10 minutes to wrap it up, fill out the chain of custody form, and then get the testing ready for the next person. So extremely easy to use. You don't have to send anybody out to a collection center. This is what the test looks like. Basically, it's a swab you put between your cheek and your gums. Leave it down there, rub it a few times, leave it there, and then it goes into that small test tube, gets packed up and sent to the lab overnight. So you do get the results in 24 hours. With OraSure Technologies, who's the sponsor of this webinar, it's really important to note that they have 10-plus years proven performance with more than 15 million samples tested. It's the only lab-based saliva test on the market with this much history and is the #1 recognized brand. When I ask my customers what they really like about Intercept, it always comes down to 2 different items. The reduced downtime, which is also reduced cost, and also virtually no chance of adulteration. And because of that, it's a very, very popular test. Also, when we talk about 15 million samples here, OraSure did a study of 5 million tests and found that it detected significantly more marijuana positives, cocaine positives, and opiates than urine. All this is documented. All this is statistically proven, and customers are able to get a hold of this information. So not only are they the longest on the market with 10-plus years proven performance, they also have the best product, in my opinion, on the lab-based saliva drug testing. It's scientifically proven. It's the only oral fluid device that is that's FDA cleared for 9 assays. Legally proven, Intercept has been upheld in multiple court cases in the workplace, criminal justice, and family courts, and no special training or certification is needed. The training and certification is done online. It's relatively quick. You can watch the training video, take the test, and get your certification all in approximately 40 minutes. So you don't have to go anywhere to get any of that information. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, and he will be here in a second.
Now, Judy, let me ask you a question. I found your comments very interesting, and maybe you can help me understand a couple of things. So you actually have clients that have expressed a concern to you about these synthetic drugs. Is that right?
Yeah, every couple of weeks we have somebody give us a call and ask us what we can do regarding the synthetic drugs. It's important to note that when you are using a TPA, it's important to use a TPA who uses more than one laboratory. And the reason for this is that some labs do synthetic drugs, some do the bath salts, some don't do any. So if you want the best results for your question, it's important to know what that TPA can and can't do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add to that also with the lab that you're using, if you're planning to test for synthetic cannabinoids or bath salts, you definitely want to check with the laboratory to make sure that they're testing for, the compounds that are being used today. In many cases, some labs, trying to do the right thing are testing for first and second generation version of these substances, and sort of the whole world has moved on to third and fourth generation, and they may not actually be testing for the compounds that people are using today. So again, within the context of testing for the right drugs, make sure the lab that you're dealing with is testing for the right chemical compounds for synthetic cannabinoids or bath salts. Now, another question. So you actually then would have some clients who are expanding their testing program to include synthetic cannabinoids, for example, some K2 spice, and they would be testing with oral fluid through a laboratory for that?
Absolutely. We have a customer down in Texas, and what they've decided to do is to use Intercept for a 9-panel on pre-employment and random, and then for post-accidents, they do that 9-panel plus the synthetic marijuana. So the customer actually always has the opportunity to change what they're looking for with the laboratory. It's as easy as making a phone call and having it changed. So if somewhere down the road they decide they're not going to test for something, it's just a phone call and it's changed. It's easy to add synthetic marijuanas to the drug testing panel, and then after maybe 3 or 4 months, if they decide they want to stop doing it, they don't have to keep doing it.
Now, I want to kind of mingle into this a question that was asked by one of our attendees today, and you may know the answer to this, maybe not, but the question was, in addition to sort of the behavioral aspects of somebody who's high on synthetic cannabinoids, do you know if it smells like, quote-unquote, real pot?
From what I've heard, it does not.
Okay.
But I could, there are so many versions of it out there.
Yeah. Well, and, that's interesting because I've done a little bit of research on that issue in general, and I would agree with you on that. Some people report that there's sort of a quote-unquote faint smell of real marijuana, but that has a very heavy chemical kind of smell to it as well, which would stand to reason, of course, because you're burning these herbs, these plant substances, but they've been sprayed with a chemical. And so in the same way that meth users, have a smell to them that's more chemical than organic, the same would be true of using a chemical version of marijuana. So,
right.
And that would be important in the workplace, of course, because a worker coming back from a lunch break, for example, who has smoked a real joint would smell like marijuana. A worker coming back from a lunch break who's just smoked synthetic cannabinoids, K2 spice, might have a kind of an odd marijuana smell, but a lot of a heavy chemical smell to it as well. So there would be a way to kind of smell that, yeah.
Yep. I would like to say one thing I neglected to say before. A lot of times when people hear about lab-based saliva drug testing or instant saliva drug testing, which we're not talking about, but there are a lot of misconceptions about saliva drug testing. And OraSure, as the number one, having the number one product and having been on the market the longest, has a lot of documentation to dispel any of those myths. So if anybody attending this webinar has any questions about lab-based saliva drug testing, I would really encourage them to submit the questions. And not only can we answer the questions for them, but because OraSure is such an incredible company, they have documentation to back it up.
Okay, perfect. Now, you did mention the various state laws that apply to oral fluid testing. I would add one thing to that, and one of our attendees asked this question, which is that instant devices, POCT devices that can be used with oral fluid instead of urine, There would be some states that don't necessarily ban instant oral fluid testing, but they don't allow instant testing, period. And so with lab-based oral fluid testing, you're going to have, like Judy said, almost an entire list of states that will allow it. There may be some, some caveats, some regulations here and there. But if you're interested in using instant oral fluid testing, you're going to run into a lot more states that don't allow it simply because they don't allow instant testing devices, like Minnesota, for example, would be an example of a state.
Exactly. And people refuse to believe that there are these laws against using instant test, instant urine, or instant saliva in their states. And, for example, there's a quirky little twist on using instant test in the state of New York, for example. And when I talk to to some of the people, they say, well, I'm going to use instant. That's what I want to use. And, I say, look, you really can't. You have to know what the law is. Whereas with Intercept, we don't find all those quirks to the laws. It's lab-based, and it has a great reputation.
So, Judy, in addition to the SAMHSA 5 drugs, marijuana, cocaine, opiates, amphetamine, and PCP, what other drugs would you test for with an oral fluid test?
Well, typically what we see is people want to know, employers want to know if their employees are using Percocet and OxyContin. So that would be the expanded opiates panel. We're also seeing requests for benzos and barbs. And, of course, these are valid drugs for people that need to take them. The thing that you have to be aware of is that people are not over-abusing them. So even, for example, with OxyContin, people naturally think if one OxyContin makes me feel good, two are going to make me feel better. I won't have any of this pain. But then it dulls their perception and dulls what they can do, particularly in a manufacturing situation or construction. You don't want them to be exceeding the level on those drugs, which lab-based saliva drug testing, Intercept, will definitely show you.
Okay. Now, I got another state law question here. I'll take a stab at it. The question was, are there any restrictions on doing oral fluid testing in Ohio? And the answer is twofold. In Ohio, there is not a mandatory drug testing law that applies generally. There is, however, a very popular voluntary drug testing law that offers participants in the program a discount in their workers' compensation premiums if they follow the guidelines of the program. Within that program, and it used to be different a few years ago, but they changed it. Nowadays, in that program, it requires compliance with the DOT regulations, Part 40, 49 CFR Part 40, the SAMHSA guidelines. So in that regard, it would not allow for alternative specimens like hair testing, for example, or oral fluid testing, or POCT devices for that matter. But outside of the voluntary guidelines, the voluntary law for the workers' comp premium discount, if you're an employer in Ohio and you don't want to participate in the program or you don't qualify to participate in the program, then those restrictions that are part of the voluntary law would not apply to you. So it probably represents the majority of employers in the state who do drug testing. They're not actually restricted under that voluntary law. So the answer is yes, for the most part, you can do oral fluid testing in Ohio unless you're participating in that workers' comp premium discount program. If you're a small business, you're not self-insured, et cetera, you might be in that program, but for the most part, you can. Now, I did have another question here about the difference between FDA clearance and FDA approval, and I think you mentioned, Judy, you mentioned the fact that in this case, the OraSure device, the Intercept device, is FDA cleared as opposed to approved. And the difference is that the FDA would clear a device when it is, quote unquote, substantially equivalent, if you will. That's the terminology that they use, to another legally marketed device. So another product that's similar to this that is already legally being marketed, if you have a substantially equivalent product to that, and the FDA has determined that you don't have to qualify for pre-market approval, then your device could be FDA cleared if you qualify. A pre-market approval, the FDA approved device, if you will, is usually reserved for higher risk medical type devices, and would be a much more rigorous sort of pre-market approval review process that you would have to go to versus the FDA clearance, which is the 510K clearance usually typically referred to. So when we talk about like the Intercept device, that would be a 510K cleared device. That's an FDA cleared device versus something that would require the approval process, the pre-market approval. So. And so I hope that answers the question. We've got just a ton of questions here, and as Judy and I are talking, I'm trying to go through these. Yes, I think as Jessica mentioned at the beginning, the recording will be available. And I see that we're out of time, so we didn't get to the legal marijuana. We've got a whole presentation we can do on that. We didn't get to questions about the cost of the device and things like that. All questions that were submitted will get answered. We'll send those out to you for those of you who are on today's call, and make sure that you get answers to your questions about synthetic cannabinoids, bath salts, as well as oral fluid testing, and any information that you want about the OraSure device as well. Thank you very much, Judy, for your time and for your very valuable, significant